Have you ever had someone call the police on you for protecting your own property? Well, last week, an entitled HOA Karen did exactly that. She called 911 because I wouldn't let her trespass through my backyard anymore. But here's the crazy part. She'd been illegally using my land for years, and when I finally stood up to her, she completely lost it. I'm about to show you how this power-hungry HOA board member went from threatening me with lawyers to literally screaming at police officers in my driveway. And trust me, if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors or HOA drama, you're going to want to hear how this ends. But before I tell you how I finally shut her down, you need to understand just how deep this entitlement went. Because what started as a simple property line dispute turned into a full-blown neighborhood war that exposed years of illegal activity by the HOA board. I never thought buying my dream home would lead to security cameras, police reports, and legal threats. But that's exactly what happened when I discovered that half my backyard was being treated like a public park by an entire neighborhood. Let me take you back to where this all started, because the red flags I ignored on day one came back to haunt me in ways I never could have imagined. When I first saw this house, I fell in love with its privacy. 3 acres of wooded land backing up to a fancy HOA neighborhood. It seemed perfect. The previous owner was practically giving it away, and now I know why. The first weekend after moving in, I was having coffee on my back deck when I noticed something strange. A group of people were walking their dogs through my backyard, acting like they owned the place. Not just passing through, they had lawn chairs, coolers, and were setting up for what looked like a picnic. At first, I thought maybe they were confused, how some neighbors can be when a new person moves in. But when I walked over to introduce myself, their response changed everything. "Oh, honey," this woman said, dripping with condescension. "This is the community recreation area. It's been this way for 15 years. The HOA maintains it." Except it wasn't, and they didn't. I pulled out my property documents that night and discovered something shocking. That community recreation area? It was 100% my land. Every single inch of it. The previous owner had just let them use it for years. But it gets worse. While reviewing the documents, I found something that made my stomach drop. The HOA had actually been listing this part of my property in their community brochures. They were advertising my land as their amenity. And based on the dates, they'd been doing it for over a decade. I spent the next week watching from my security cameras as people treated my property like a public park. Kids playing, couples having picnics, someone even tried to set up a birthday party. All while I sat there getting more frustrated by the minute. That's when I decided to do something about it. I had no idea that putting up a simple private property sign would trigger a chain of events that would expose years of HOA corruption and lead to the most entitled Karen I've ever met, completely losing her mind. I wish I could say putting up those private property signs solved the problem, but that's when things really started getting weird. The next morning I woke up to find all my signs had been torn down. Not just removed, completely destroyed. And there was a note taped to my front door that made my blood boil. "These signs are against HOA regulations. Remove them immediately or face fines. HOA board." Here's the thing they didn't seem to understand. I wasn't part of their HOA. My property wasn't in their jurisdiction. But apparently, that little detail didn't matter to them. I decided to do this the right way. I hired a professional surveyor to mark my property lines. Cost me $2,000, but it was worth every penny. The results? Even worse than I thought. The HOA had actually built a playground set that was 15 feet into my property. They'd installed benches, planted trees, even put up their own signs, all on my land. But the real kicker came when I checked the county records. The HOA had never owned this land, never had an easement, never had any legal right to use it. They'd just taken it, and the previous owner had let them. So I took the next logical step. I installed security cameras and started documenting everything. And boy, am I glad I did. Within the first week, I caught 3 HOA board members removing my new signs, someone trying to install a new bench on my property, a landscaping crew paid by the HOA mowing my land, and the crown jewel, an HOA board meeting being held at their picnic area, which was actually my backyard. I sent certified letters to the HOA board documenting everything. Their response? Complete silence. They ignored me for 2 weeks straight. That's when I decided to take more serious action. I hired a contractor to install a fence around my property line. Nothing fancy, just a simple chain-link fence to mark what was mine. The contractor had barely started digging the first post hole when it happened. A black SUV came screeching up my driveway, and out stepped the final boss of all Karens, Linda, the HOA board president. What happened next was so outrageous, I still have trouble believing it actually happened. But thankfully, my security cameras caught every single second. Let me paint you a picture of Linda. Designer sunglasses perched on her highlighted Karen bob, clipboard in hand, and an expression that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager of the universe." "Stop what you're doing right now!" she shrieked at my contractor. Poor guy nearly dropped his post digger. "This is HOA property, and you are not authorized to build here." Now, I'd been waiting for this moment. I calmly walked out, property survey in hand, security cameras rolling. "Actually, Linda, this is my property. I have the documentation right here." She didn't even look at the papers. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started recording me. "I'm on the HOA board, and we've maintained this land for 15 years. That gives us adverse possession rights." I couldn't help but laugh. "That's not how adverse possession works, Linda. And I have proof the previous owner gave you permission to use this land, which nullifies any adverse possession claim." Her face turned a shade of red I didn't know was humanly possible. "You think you're so smart? Watch this." She dialed her phone, turned on speaker, and what happened next was pure gold. 911. What's your emergency? Yes, I need police immediately. Someone is vandalizing HOA property and threatening me. The dispatcher's voice crackled. "Ma'am, what kind of threats? He's building an illegal fence and destroying our community playground." I just stood there, recording everything, trying not to laugh as she dug herself deeper. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up. But Linda's smug expression didn't last long. I had everything ready. Property deed, recent survey, security camera footage, photos of HOA members removing my signs, county records showing property boundaries, letters I'd sent to the HOA board. The officers reviewed everything right there in my driveway. One of them turned to Linda. "Ma'am, this is clearly private property. You're the one trespassing right now." "But we've been using it for years," she screamed, actually stamping her foot like a toddler. "That doesn't make it yours," the officer replied. "If you continue to harass this property owner, you'll be facing criminal charges." That's when Linda completely lost it. She started ranting about property values, community standards, and how I was destroying the neighborhood aesthetic. Then she made the mistake that would ultimately cost her everything. Linda's big mistake? She tried to physically stop the contractor from working. Right there, in front of 2 police officers, she grabbed the post digger and tried to pull it away. The officers immediately stepped in, and Linda found herself being escorted back to her SUV with a criminal trespassing warning. But this wasn't the end. Oh no. This was just the beginning of Linda's nuclear meltdown. Within 24 hours, 3 things happened. First, I received a certified letter from the HOA's lawyer threatening to sue me for destruction of community property and diminishing property values. The letter was riddled with legal mistakes. They clearly didn't know what they were talking about. Second, Linda started a Facebook group called Save Our Community Space and posted my personal information. She even encouraged people to make their voices heard by protesting on my property. That backfired spectacularly when someone in the comments pointed out that doxing is illegal. But the third thing? That's what really showed everyone who Linda really was. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Now, remember those security cameras I installed? They caught everything. Linda stood up in front of 50 homeowners and told the biggest lie I've ever heard. "This man forged his property documents. I have proof that this land was deeded to the HOA 20 years ago." What she didn't know was that I had already spoken to several long-term residents. They confirmed the previous owner had only allowed the HOA to use the land as a courtesy. Even better? One of those residents was a retired real estate attorney who'd been keeping records for years. He stood up right in the middle of Linda's rant. "Linda," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "are you aware that falsifying property claims is a felony in our state?" The room went dead silent. You could literally hear Linda's career on the HOA board crumbling. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. And what she did next would end up on the local news. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of construction equipment. Linda had actually hired a private contractor to remove my partially built fence at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. But here's the beautiful part. My security system had sent alerts to both me and the police department. By the time I got outside, 2 police cars were already pulling up. Linda was standing there in her designer pajamas, pointing at my property and screaming at the contractor. "Ma'am," one officer said, "this is now criminal destruction of property. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Watching Linda get arrested in her $200 pajamas while her neighbors filmed from their driveways was a moment I'll never forget. But the real justice was still to come. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that evening. This time, they weren't playing around. They had proof of Linda's illegal actions, documentation of misused HOA funds, evidence she'd been lying to residents for years, records of her personal use of HOA resources. Turns out, Linda had been using HOA maintenance funds to landscape her private park, my property, for years. She'd even used HOA money to install that playground without proper permits or safety inspections. The board voted unanimously to remove her. But it gets better. Remember that retired real estate attorney? He helped other residents file a class action lawsuit against Linda personally for misappropriation of HOA funds. The amount? Over $50,000 in misused maintenance fees. The new HOA board approached me with a proper legal agreement, formal acknowledgement of my property rights, written apology for past encroachment, offer to remove all HOA installations at their expense, agreement to maintain a proper fence between properties. As for Linda? Last I heard, she put her house up for sale and moved to Florida. Apparently, living across from the property she tried to steal was too much for her ego. The playground equipment was donated to a local park, where it's actually insured and properly maintained. My property is now properly fenced, and my new neighbors? They wave and smile instead of trying to steal my land. Sometimes standing up to entitled people isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting an entire community from their abuse of power. After that HOA meeting, Linda launched what I can only describe as a psychological warfare campaign. But she didn't realize she was giving me everything I needed to end this once and for all. First came the anonymous letters in my mailbox. Your property values will tank when the community turns against you. Hope you enjoy being the neighborhood pariah. Maybe your house will have an unfortunate accident. That last one? That's when my lawyer's eyes lit up. Written threats. Exactly what we needed. But Linda wasn't done. She organized what she called a community unity picnic, right on my property, posted it all over Facebook, even printed flyers. The date? The exact day my fence installation was scheduled to resume. The morning of the picnic, I woke up to find my driveway blocked by lawn chairs. Linda had actually told people to park across my driveway to protect our community space. She was standing there in a Save Our Park t-shirt, handing out lemonade like some kind of suburban general rallying her troops. What she didn't expect was that I'd already notified the police department about the planned trespassing, hired private security with body cams, set up additional cameras covering every angle, had my lawyer on standby, invited the local news. They love HOA drama. The news crew arrived just as Linda was giving her speech about community rights and standing up to property bullies. The reporter's first question, "Ms. Linda, can you explain why you're encouraging people to trespass on private property after receiving a criminal warning from police?" Her response was priceless. She snatched at the microphone, screaming about how the media was fake news and part of some conspiracy against HOAs, all while wearing that custom t-shirt that basically admitted she was organizing criminal activity. But here's where it got really interesting. One of the neighbors, an older gentleman who'd been quietly watching, stepped forward. "Linda," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you tell them about the HOA funds you used to build that playground? Or about the landscaping company your brother owns that's been billing us triple for maintaining this area?" The crowd went silent. Linda's face went white. That's when another neighbor spoke up. "Is that why our HOA fees went up last year? To pay for your brother's company?" The news crew was eating this up. Their cameras caught every second as Linda's carefully orchestrated protest imploded. People started pulling out their phones, recording her reaction, asking questions about HOA funds. Linda tried to regain control. "This is about our community, about protecting our property values." "No," another resident cut in. "This is about you using our money to build a private park on someone else's land. We want to see the books." That's when Linda made her fatal mistake. In front of rolling news cameras, dozens of witnesses, and my security system, she grabbed a garden hose and she turned the hose full blast on the news crew's expensive camera equipment. "Get off my property!" she screamed, completely losing it. "All of you!" The reporter's face was priceless. "Ma'am, this isn't your property, and you just destroyed $15,000 worth of equipment on camera." That's when everything exploded, literally and figuratively. Linda, still spraying the hose wildly, slipped on the wet grass. As she fell, the hose whipped around and knocked over her precious lemonade stand, sending glass pitchers shattering everywhere. But instead of calming down, she jumped up and ran straight for my security cameras. "I'll show you what happens to people who try to destroy our community," she screamed, trying to climb up my fence post to reach the camera. Remember that private security team I hired? They were already calling for backup as Linda's supporters started arguing with other neighbors about HOA funds. The whole scene had devolved into chaos. News crew documenting everything, neighbors yelling about missing HOA money. Linda trying to destroy evidence. Police sirens getting closer, kids crying over spilled lemonade, and my lawyer, calmly recording everything on his phone. Then someone shouted, "The HOA documents are being shredded." Everyone turned to see smoke coming from Linda's SUV. Through the window, you could clearly see her teenage daughter frantically feeding papers into a portable shredder. That's when 3 police cars pulled up, lights flashing. "Everybody freeze!" The officer who'd warned Linda just days before stepped out, took one look at the scene, and said into his radio, "We're gonna need backup, and bring the forensic accountant." Linda, still dripping wet, tried to make a break for her car. But remember that garden hose? It had wrapped around her designer sandals. She face-planted right in front of the news crew, giving them the perfect shot for their evening headline. HOA president arrested after property dispute turns violent. But the real bombshell was still to come. As the police were sorting through the chaos, Linda's brother showed up. The one with the landscaping company. He took one look at the scene and decided to save himself. Linda's brother walked straight up to the police, hands raised. "I want to make a deal. I have proof of everything." Turns out he'd been keeping his own records. Smart man. He pulled out his phone and started showing emails, contracts, and bank statements. The officer's eyes got wider with each swipe. Here's what he revealed. Linda had been double billing the HOA for years. The playground equipment, bought used, billed as new. Maintenance contracts inflated by 300%. Personal landscaping for board members charged to HOA. Over $200,000 in questionable expenses. But the biggest revelation? Linda had been running this scam in 3 different HOA communities. The news crew was practically salivating. Their simple property dispute story had just turned into a major fraud investigation. The reporter pulled me aside. "Sir, would you be willing to go on record? This is turning into one of the biggest HOA corruption stories we've covered." Meanwhile, Linda was having an absolute meltdown in the back of the police car. Through the open window, we could hear her screaming, "It's all lies. I did everything for this community. That land belongs to all of us." The police were now going through her SUV, with her daughter's permission, and finding even more evidence. Apparently, shredding documents only makes them more interesting to forensic accountants. Other neighbors started coming forward. She threatened to put a lien on my house when I questioned the fee increase. She denied my solar panel request unless I used her brother's company. She's been charging us special assessments for playground maintenance for years. The officer in charge turned to me. "Sir, we're going to need copies of all your security footage." This just became a much bigger investigation. That's when Linda's husband showed up. Instead of defending her, he walked straight to the officers. "I want to cooperate. She's been hiding money in offshore accounts. I have the bank statements." Linda's face through the police car window? Priceless. But what happened next at the emergency HOA meeting that evening? That's when the real justice began. Picture this. The community center packed with angry homeowners, police officers standing guard, and a forensic accountant setting up a PowerPoint presentation. I almost felt bad for the HOA board members who weren't in on Linda's scheme. Almost. The interim HOA president, a retired judge named Barbara, called the meeting to order. Her first words set the tone. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've uncovered today goes beyond simple financial mismanagement. We're looking at systematic fraud. The PowerPoint flickered to life, showing a web of shell companies, inflated invoices, and doctored maintenance records. With each slide, the gasps got louder. Playground equipment, bought for $12,000, billed at $45,000. Monthly landscaping, real cost $2,000, billed at $8,500. Special assessments that never went to actual projects. Personal vacations disguised as HOA training conferences. A network of fake companies all leading back to Linda's family. But here's the kicker. Remember my property dispute? Turns out Linda had been using it as a smokescreen for years. By maintaining this community space on my land, she had a perfect excuse to funnel money through her brother's company for maintenance. One elderly resident stood up, shaking with anger. I had to take out a loan to pay those special assessments. I trusted you, Linda. The forensic accountant cleared his throat. Based on our preliminary findings, each household in this community has been overcharged approximately $15,000 over the past 5 years. The room erupted, but the real bombshell was still coming. A young mom near the front raised her hand. What about the playground? My kids play there every day. Was it even inspected? The room went dead silent as Barbara pulled up the next slide. The playground equipment, the one Linda charged $45,000 for? It had been bought used from a condemned park in another state. No safety inspections, no permits, nothing. That's when Linda's entire house of cards finally collapsed, and what happened next would change HOA regulations across the entire state. 3 months have passed since that explosive HOA meeting, and the dominoes are still falling. Here's what happened. Linda pled guilty to multiple felony charges: grand theft, wire fraud, falsifying business records, criminal conspiracy, destruction of evidence. She's now facing 8 to 12 years in prison, and her brother turned state's evidence for a reduced sentence. But the real justice? The restitution payments. The court ordered Linda and her co-conspirators to repay $3.2 million to the 3 HOA communities they defrauded. Her house, cars, and that vacation home in Florida? All seized and auctioned off to repay the residents. Remember that retired judge, Barbara? She worked with state legislators to draft the HOA Transparency Act, requiring annual forensic audits, public bidding for all contracts, criminal background checks for board members, strict oversight of special assessments, regular property surveys. They're calling it Linda's Law. Not exactly the legacy she was hoping for. As for my property, the new HOA board approached me with an actual legal proposal. They offered to purchase a small easement for a proper playground, with permits, install security lighting and cameras, share maintenance costs, provide proper insurance coverage. I agreed, but with one condition. The new playground would be dedicated to that elderly resident who had to take out loans to pay Linda's fake assessments. The grand opening is next month, and yes, there will be lemonade. Properly permitted this time. The best part? Last week I received a letter from a neighboring HOA. They've started their own forensic audit after reading about our story. Apparently Linda's scheme wasn't as unique as we thought. Sometimes it takes one person standing up to a bully to expose a much bigger problem. My simple property dispute ended up protecting thousands of homeowners from corrupt HOA boards. Oh, and that news crew whose camera Linda destroyed? They won a local Emmy for their coverage. They even interviewed me for their follow-up series, HOAs, Power, Corruption, and Your Rights. As for me, I finally finished my fence. It's got a nice gate where the easement starts, with a plaque that reads, Community Park, where transparency meets trust. Linda's daughter stopped by last week to apologize. She's studying law now, specializing in property rights and HOA regulations. Sometimes the best lessons come from watching exactly what not to do. Remember, folks, document everything, know your rights, and never let anyone convince you that standing up for yourself is wrong. Because sometimes, what starts as protecting your own backyard ends up protecting an entire community.